Hello friends, welcome to Pathshala. I am Deen Mani, a lecturer at Jawaharlal Nehru University. We will be discussing nationalism in Imperial Japan. The year 1868 is characterized by the fall of Tokugawa shogunate and consequent Meiji Restoration. This year proved to be the most eventful one in Japanese history, for it marks the transition of Japan from a feudal nation to an industrialized and modern nation. The nationalistic movement that started from protesting against the treaty and agreement signed by the Bakufu with Western nations eventually brought the collapse of more than 2.5 century old Tokugawa shogunate. Meiji Restoration introduced a sharp bend in the stream of Japanese history. Japan looked frail and inferior before the West in all spheres, including economic, political, and strategic. It was the period of world history when the wave of imperialism and colonization of Asian and African nations was spreading with rising momentum. Japan was not in a position to resist the prevailing tendencies of the West and found itself on the verge of falling victim of imperialism. But the nationalistic leaders of Japan, under the guidance of Meiji Emperor, resolved to safeguard their country against probable assault of West. They saw a sure way to save Japan by wielding superior military and economic power and capacities in comparison to Western nations. Japan's westernization movement during the Meiji era came to be known as Bummei Kaika. The road before these leaders was long and fraught with difficulties. Emperor Meiji introduced many radical reforms to modernize Japanese military and revitalize economy. The knowledge was sought after from every corner of the world and introduced and assimilated in Japan. The adventurer industrialists called Zaibatsu helped Japan embark on the path of heavy industrialization. The land reform brought agricultural revolution in Japan. In the small span of less than 20 years, Japan came at par with the Western powers and shrugged off the fear of becoming colonized. With passage of time, Japanese military grew in strength and embarked on the very same path of Western imperialism. Japan defeated China in 1895, signed the Equality Treaty with Great Britain in 1902, and further defeated the giant Russia in 1905. The Japanese army unleashed its violent ambition of conquest and building an empire like Great Britain. The ambition of Japanese army spiraled out of control, which led it to war and destruction. Iwakura Mission, which can be seen as the intellect inspired by nationalism. The Western powers were ravenous and going from one continent to the other in search of resources to fuel their industrial and economic growth. This reality was acknowledged by the leaders of Japan, that it can also be subjected to the same fate as other nations. They also woke up to the reality that only a powerful nation can safeguard itself against the mighty Western nations, and hence the need of the day is to strengthen Japan. The idea to strengthen Japan and build a strong bulwark against the Western powers by emulating Western ways found its voice in words of the Meiji Emperor, who proclaimed only 2 months after the Battle of Fushimi and consequent fall of Tokugawa Bakufu that knowledge must be sought from every corner of the planet to guide Japan in shaping its future course. This was expressed eloquently by the slogan of the time, Fukoku Kyohei, that translates as Rich Country, Strong Army. Due to the policy of isolation of the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan failed to keep the pace with the scientific and industrial developments taking place in Europe and America. It lacked the substratum of scientific knowledge that was required for the modern technology that could in turn serve as the vehicle of the modernization of Japan. In order to equip Japan with comprehensive knowledge of political, military, industrial, and educational advances exhibited by Europe and America, some of promising statesmen and scholars of Japan were sent to the Western world between the years 1871 to 1873. This mission of gathering knowledge in an eclectic manner was led by noted statesmen of Japan, Iwakura Tomomi. In order to study the science and technology of naval affairs, students were sent to England, for it had unrivaled naval power. Some scholars were sent to Germany for learning the expertise of training and maintaining the armed forces. Some students were dispatched to France for learning law and governance, and to the United States of America for learning business methods. The individuals who were entrusted the responsibility of learning, assimilating, and then transmitting the knowledge to Japan were extraordinarily devoted people. These individuals were driven by the spirit of Japanese nationalism, who accomplished their work despite excruciating hard work. The Iwakura mission included prominent individuals like Hido Takayoshi, Yamaguchi Yasuka, Iwakura Tomomi, Ito Hirobumi, Okubo Toshimichi, among others. The Meiji Restoration did not bring only the end of the Bakufu rule, but it also destroyed the long-standing structure of feudalism and laid the foundation of modernization in Japan. The fundamental law of the nation was reflected in the constitution, which was ceremoniously bestowed by the Meiji Emperor as the gracious gift to the people of Japan in 1889. It clearly stated the sacrosanct nature of imperial institution and emphasized that the emperor is divine entity and hence inviolable under all circumstances. The Japanese constitution was not by any means democratic, but it clearly defined the role and duties of Japanese populace, including the commoners and aristocracy. The duties of common people were of twofold. It expected them to pay taxes and to serve the army. The aristocracy was entrusted with the responsibility of maintaining the apparatus of state. The voting rights were not granted to every citizen, but nonetheless, it initiated the electoral procedure, waiting for further improvements in future. The women were also not given equal status and remained as second-rate citizens. Shinto was declared as the state religion for religious uniformity and homogeneity, but later, Buddhism was also accepted due to the persistent demand of Buddhists from around the country. Nationalism is also propagated through the education policy of Meiji era. The Imperial Rescript on Education of 1890 provided impetus to the idea of national service. The document issued by the imperial institution allowed the government to take the control of education and related institutions in its hands. The primary objective was to provide modern education to the students without compromising the Japanese spirit. The textbooks were prepared especially by the Ministry of Education to indoctrinate the students during their tender age. The feelings of pride for one's nation, reverence for the emperor, patriotism and readiness for sacrifice remained an important aspects to the new education policies. The education was stretching its reach in Japan and soon began to take a universal form. The government took many initiatives of opening new universities and private schools. As a result, Japan became the most literate country in Asia. New concepts developing in West were being introduced to Japan. In addition, many newspapers and magazines were published, which threw fresh light on the social, economic, and political events developing in Japan. The expansion of education gave new stimulus to the intellectual fervor of Japan and filled the nation with renewed hope. The new developments in intellectual spheres gave momentum to the notion of nationalism in Japan by restoring faith and pride in everything distinctly Japanese. Japan was well on its way to master the aspects of modern education responsible for the rise of West. One of the unfinished objectives of Iwakura mission was to end the unequal treaty. This treaty was a constant pain in the neck of Japanese people and reminded them of their inferior status before the West. The issue of extraterritoriality, which gave immunity to foreign nationals from the Japanese law courts, seemed humiliating to Japanese. These foreigners were not to be tried in Japanese courts for the crimes that they would commit on Japanese soil. This was emanating from the belief that Western civilization is superior to Japanese civilization, and the same goes for ideals and institutions. The government of Japan, waking up to the rising sense of resentment against unequal status, intensified its diplomatic initiatives to end the said treaties. Finally, In the year 1894, after long and strenuous talks with Britain and the United States of America, the unequal treaties were declared null and void. This restored the lost pride of Japan and faith of its people. The sense of inferiority that was instilled through the inequality in status gave way to a new pride and enthusiasm amongst Japanese people. Now they began to believe that they can be as good as anybody in all possible endeavors. One of the major aspects which gave impetus to nationalism was military reforms of Meiji era. One of the major achievements of Meiji Restoration was the military reforms. Prior to the reform, the military was comprised of the samurais, whose conduct was guided by the Bushido ideals. As we know that there are 4 pillars of Bushido: chivalry, courage, honor and loyalty, and samurais were bound by these codes. Meiji Emperor made the appointments in military open for everyone capable of army requirements and training. It remained no more a samurai affair. Imperial Conscription was issued in 1872, which declared that all men of 20 years were required to serve in the army for 3 years. It was considered a way to show the loyalty to the state and instill the feelings of nationality in the hearts and mind of young men. The new armed forces were highly disciplined and prepared to go to war at any point of time. With each passing day, the Japanese military grew in strength, and so grew the ambition of its commanders. Japan was worried about the growing influence of China in Korea. Korea has long been China's client state, but Japan was now ready to take Korea under its own sphere of influence because of its natural resources like coal and iron. The strategic location of Korea was also important for Japan's security. The two countries went to war for their supremacy over Korea in 1894. This was the first occasion when Japanese military proved its superiority and agility in war. Japan forced all Chinese troops out of Korea, seized Port Arthur, and kept 7 divisions of military poised to move into China if necessary. China was defeated in the war, which ended with the Treaty of Shimonoseki. The Treaty of Shimonoseki ended the conflict between Japan and China. China recognized the independence of Korea and Japanese interest in it. China also ceded Taiwan, then known as Formosa, Liaotung Peninsula in Manchuria, including the harbor city of Port Arthur. In addition, China also agreed to pay large indemnity and gave Japan trading privileges in China. The conflict ended in a great victory for Japan and a humiliating defeat for China. The Japanese people were jubilant over such a victory and the emergence of Japan as a formidable regional power. However, this sense of victory was short-lived for Japan. For Japan soon began to feel the international diplomatic pressure. Russia was the first country to become wary of growing Japanese power, and it persuaded France and Germany to apply pressure on Japan for returning the Chinese territory. The 3 countries together mounted the pressure on Japan to return Chinese territory, particularly the Port Arthur. Japan was not in a position to resist the 3 powers militarily, and it had to give up Liaotung Peninsula reluctantly. Japan was surprised to see the design of Russia when it moved almost immediately to occupy the said peninsula and particularly the Port Arthur. The Port Arthur was a very important warm water port in the east which remained functional throughout the year. Japan felt cheated and humiliated due to collective intervention of these powers. The triple intervention had profound impact on the foreign relations and diplomacy of Japan. Japan also learned an important lesson of international politics, that in order to wield power in the present order, it is important to have strong allies for striking the balance of power. Finally, in 1902, Japan signed a treaty with Great Britain as an equal sovereign nation. This treaty secured Japan from concerted intervention by a group of nations. According to the treaty, The two nations will come to support each other in case of an invasion by a joint force of two or more countries. But if they will wage a war with one individual nation, the other will remain neutral to it. This treaty proved to be a formidable bulwark for Japan against any concerted interventions in future. Japan was jubilant on becoming an equal partner with the most powerful industrial and naval nation of the time. Japan was upset with Russia for its maneuvering and controlling the Port Arthur deceitfully. Japan thought of regaining its claim on the Liaotung Peninsula and Port Arthur. Japan also wanted Russia to recognize its special interest in Korea and Manchuria. The rising tension between the two countries reached its crescendo in 1905 when Japan and Russia went to war against each other. Japan surprised the world by displaying exceptional military capability and defeating the giant nation Russia. The battle came to an end when the two nations met at the Portsmouth in 1905 to negotiate the terms and conditions of peace through American mediation. Japan asked for railway rights in Manchuria, control of Port Arthur, the southern end of Sakhalin, and a large indemnity. Russia refused to give the indemnity but accepted all other demands of Japan. It was a great success of Japan, which earned Japan the reputation of a great regional power. But this rising nationalism in Japan was not only having the positives for it, it also has got negative impacts for Japan. Japanese army was experiencing victory in combats and earning respect for an emerging great power. Japan was now both admired and feared for its success and turned more ambitious for power and global recognition. The Japanese army, driven by nationalist spirit, grew more confident and began to extend its influence in China and Manchuria. In 1931, Japan occupied Manchuria with the help of the Kwantung Army. Many believed that there was a contrast between the thoughts of Japanese government and the military. However, the nationalist groups like the Black Dragon and others supported the army, and it became dangerous to denounce the army in Japan. Japanese army in the course of its conquest also gained the reputation of savagery, particularly because of murdering civilians and treating women and children in the barbaric manner in what is known as Nanking Massacre. In 1941, the Japanese army under the leadership of General Tojo attacked Pearl Harbor and brought the United States of America in the Second World War. The war between Japan and the US came to an end after 1364 days with the infamous atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on 6th and 9th August 1945 respectively. On 15th August 1945, the Japanese emperor announced the surrender of Japan, and this brought the end of the imperial rule. The Meiji Restoration and the reforms afterwards placed Japan on the path of exemplary growth and development. The pace and intensity with which Japan brought modernization remains an inspirational story. Japan gathered great strength, wielded formidable power, and earned status of equality with established powers of the day. It registered series of conquests, built an empire, and aspired to establish a new Asian order. Many factors contributed to all these accomplishments of Japan, but one common thread that runs through every event is the spirit of nationalism. Japan aspired to assert itself by going after glory and greatness because its people believed it to be a great nation. However, in the process, Japan also experienced its share of troubles, travails, infamy, and upheavals. With this, we come to the end of this. Thank you very much.